Imagine finding out that the most read, most debated, and arguably most influential book in human history doesn't have a single surviving original copy.
Oh, yeah.
Like, not one piece of parchment, not a single scrap of papyrus anywhere.
It is a startling realization for a lot of people. I
Hmm.
mean, every single Bible you have ever seen, whether it's, in a hotel nightstand, on a library shelf, or sitting right there on your pulpit, it's a translation based on a copy of a copy of a copy.
Which, if we are being completely honest, sounds a bit like the setup for a massive historical conspiracy theory, right?
Right.
Like, if we don't have the originals, how can anyone confidently claim to know what the text originally said? How do we know some medieval king didn't just edit the parts he didn't like?
Exactly. It's the elephant in the room whenever we talk about ancient texts. And honestly, it is a completely valid, really necessary question to ask. If you are going to base your worldview, if you're going to base your life on a collection of ancient documents, you need to know exactly where those documents came from, how they survived, how they were assembled.
And that is exactly why we are here today. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take a massive step back and look at the grand architecture of the New Testament.
Right.
To do this, we are opening up an incredibly comprehensive source document. It's essentially a masterclass lesson plan, a foundational guide designed specifically for teaching a New Testament survey.
And what is particularly fascinating about our source material today is its intended audience.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Because this isn't some dry, esoteric, academic paper meant to be debated in an ivory tower.
Mhm.
This document was explicitly designed to equip you. The lay leaders, the volunteers, the teachers of the local church.
Right.
It treats the text as something living and active. It's meant for ministry.
Right, it's meant for the person who is, volunteering to lead a small group on a Tuesday night,
Hmm.
and suddenly you get hit with a profound, super difficult theological question from someone in your group who's in an active crisis.
All right.
And you feel that pressure, right, to instantly act like a human GPS.
Oh, man, that human GPS feeling is so real.
You know the expectation. Someone brings you a messy life problem, and you feel like you're supposed to just point to a specific chapter and verse and say, turn left here, and your life is fixed.
We all crave that kind of binary simplicity, right? We want a clean formula, problem, neat verse, boom, solved.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the biblical landscape is vastly more complex, incredibly rich, and just deeply nuanced. When you step into the world of these ancient texts, that simplistic GPS approach immediately loses its signal.
It really does.
Yeah.
It is the definition of a dense forest. So today, instead of getting lost in the weeds and staring at the bark of individual trees, we are mapping the entire forest.
That's the goal.
We are going to explore the explosive historical context that allowed this message to go viral. We'll look at the meticulous architectural structure of this 27-book library.
And how these texts miraculously survived millennia of wars and empire collapses.
Yes. And finally, the rigorous rules of engagement scholars use to interpret them today, which is going to be so practical for leading your ministries.
Whether you are someone who has read these texts 100 times, or you are just wildly curious about how a cornerstone of Western civilization was actually constructed, this overview is going to give you a completely new lens.
It really will.
It's going to completely change your vantage point on history.
Yeah,
And practically, it's going to take so much weight off your shoulders as you lead.
absolutely. So let's dive right into the geopolitical deep end. The source document begins with the historical and cultural powder keg of the first century.
Yeah.
We are talking roughly AD 45 to 95.
Right.
The text describes this era as a highly unique, almost perfectly engineered blend of three massive forces.
That's a collision.
A total collision. You've got Roman political dominance, Greek culture, and Jewish religious tradition.
Yeah.
It is literally the perfect historical storm.
It truly was an unprecedented moment in human history. I mean, to understand any text, you have to understand the soil it grew in. So let's start with the Roman element. Our source highlights a concept called the Pax Romana.
Which translates to the Roman peace.
Yes, the Roman peace.
So when we say peace, we need to be really careful, right? Because this wasn't a peaceful utopian society where everyone was like holding hands and singing.
Not at all.
This was a peace achieved through absolute, brutal, iron-fisted military conquest.
Precisely. It was peace by subjugation. Step out of line, and the legions show up.
Yeah.
But the byproduct of Rome conquering basically everything in the Mediterranean basin was a sudden, sweeping elimination of borders.
Right.
Before the Romans, the Mediterranean world was a fractured, chaotic collection of constantly warring city-states and independent kingdoms. Travel was incredibly dangerous. I mean, the seas were just swarming with pirates.
So if you were a merchant or just an ordinary traveler, taking a boat from one end of the Mediterranean to the other was practically a death sentence?
Exactly. It was a massive gamble. But Rome needed to move their legions quickly. Right? And they needed to collect taxes efficiently. The empire doesn't work without taxes.
Of course.
So they systematically hunted down and eradicated the pirates. Furthermore, they embarked on one of the greatest engineering feats in human history, the Roman road system.
Oh, yeah.
They built this incredible network of paved, stone-layered highways that literally crisscrossed continents.
Meaning, for the first time in human history, an ordinary person could actually travel across vast distances safely.
Yes.
You could move from Judea to Asia Minor to Rome itself without constantly fearing for your life or having to cross, hostile enemy borders every 50 miles.
It was revolutionary. And you couple that physical infrastructure with the cultural infrastructure, which was provided not by the Romans, but by the Greeks.
Right. The Greeks were there first.
Exactly. Roughly 300 years prior to the events of the New Testament, Alexander the Great had conquered this exact same territory. And his legacy was Hellenization.
Hellenization, meaning the aggressive spreading of Greek culture.
Culture, philosophy, and crucially, the Greek language.
And our source points out a vital detail here about that language. The New Testament wasn't written in classical, highbrow academic Greek, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't the language of Homer or Plato. It was written in Koine Greek.
Yes. Koine literally translates to common. I always tell people, classical Greek is the equivalent of Shakespearean English.
Okay, yeah.
It's beautiful, it's poetic, but it's dense, and it's not how normal people actually speak in the street. Koine Greek was the everyday language of the marketplace.
Right.
It was the language of the soldiers, the merchants, the fishermen. It was the universal trade language of the entire empire.
Okay, let's unpack this because the mechanism at work here is just brilliant.
It really is.
Think of it this way. The Roman Empire was essentially the internet of the ancient world.
I love this analogy.
You have this universal language in Koine Greek acting as the code-like, it's the HTML, that every single browser in the empire can read and understand. And the Roman roads and those newly safe sea routes, those are acting as the fiber optic cables.
Yes.
It was the very first time a complex message could literally go viral across entirely different continents so rapidly.
That is a phenomenal way to picture the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
Because without the Roman roads acting as the fiber optics, the messengers literally couldn't travel. They'd be stuck.
Right.
And without Koine Greek acting as the code, the message would have been stopped by language barriers at every single city limit.
You'd need a new translator every 3 days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is the hardware and the software of this ancient internet.
But what about the local user base?
Right.
The actual cradle where this viral message originated? Because our source material is very careful to emphasize the deep complexity of the Jewish context.
This is the third pillar. So you have Roman politics, Greek language, and Jewish religion. Now, at this specific time in history, the Jewish people were living under severe Roman occupation, and they were a fiercely independent people with a really rich ancient history of sovereignty. But now they're subjugated, paying these crushing taxes to a pagan emperor in Rome.
Which they hated.
Oh, they deeply resented it. And because of their ancient prophetic texts, they were longing, aching, really, for a promised Messiah.
A deliverer.
Exactly. A deliverer who would come in, restore God's kingdom, and basically kick the Romans out by force.
And it's crucial to understand they weren't a monolith, right? I think a lot of times we read ancient history and just lump everyone together. The Romans thought this, or the Jews thought that.
It's a really common mistake.
But the text mentions a massive amount of internal religious diversity and political friction among the Jewish people.
They were deeply divided on how to handle the occupation. You had various sects, all with completely different survival strategies.
Right.
First, you had the Pharisees. Now, they were a grassroots movement that believed the path forward was strict, rigorous adherence to the law of Moses. Their strategy was internal religious purity.
Like, if we just obey hard enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If Israel became perfectly holy, God would intervene and send the Messiah.
Then you had the Sadducees, who were practically the opposite.
Right. The Sadducees were the aristocratic priestly class. They controlled the temple in Jerusalem. And their survival strategy was political compromise.
Status quo.
Keep the status quo. They collaborated with the Romans to maintain their own power and keep the incredibly lucrative temple operations running smoothly.
And then there were groups that just opted out of them entirely, right? Like the Essenes.
Yeah, the Essenes essentially looked at the Pharisees and the Sadducees and said, this entire system is hopelessly corrupt. We're out.
Wow.
So they literally packed up, left society, and went out to live in isolated monastic communities out in the desert.
Oh, they're the ones who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
They are. That's the group famous for preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Hmm.
And finally, you had the Zealots, whose strategy was just violent armed revolution against Rome.
So you have this absolute pressure cooker, you have Roman boots on the ground, Greek philosophy swirling in the air, and a deeply fractured Jewish population desperate for rescue.
It was ready to explode.
And then our source mentions a massive historical pivot point, an event that changed the trajectory of Western history forever. The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Roman legions.
AD 70 is the earthquake that reshapes everything. The tension between the Zealots and the Romans finally boiled over into a full-scale Jewish revolt.
Which was a terrible idea against Rome.
A terrible idea. In response, Rome sent its most brutal legions, led by the future Emperor Titus. They besieged Jerusalem, starved the population, breached the walls, and completely leveled the city.
Just wiped it out.
Wiped it out. But the most devastating blow of all was the total destruction of the Jewish temple.
The epicenter of their religious, cultural, and national identity was literally dismantled stone by stone. In fact, if you go to Rome today, you can still see the Arch of Titus, which depicts the Roman soldiers carrying away the sacred artifacts from the Jewish temple,
Like,
the menorah.
it's chilling to see it carved in stone like that.
Mm-hmm.
The destruction of the temple deeply impacted both the Jewish communities and the rapidly expanding early Christian movement.
How so?
Well, for Judaism, it forced a massive transition. Without a temple, you can't offer sacrifices, period.
Right.
So Judaism had to pivot from a temple-centric religion managed by priests to a text-centric religion managed by rabbis. It fundamentally changed the religion.
Wow. And what about for the early Christians? Because they were caught in the middle of this.
For the early Christians who initially viewed themselves as just a sect within Judaism, the destruction of Jerusalem basically severed their geographic umbilical cord.
Ah, okay.
It forced the movement outward, away from a single centralized headquarters in Judea, and pushed it entirely out into that internet of the Roman Empire. It became a truly global, multi-ethnic movement.
It is just incredible to see how the geopolitical dominoes fell perfectly to allow this to happen.
It really is.
But here is the tension. While the Roman and Greek infrastructure provided the means for the message to travel, the actual content of that message was rooted in something much older.
Yes.
Which brings us to the next massive concept in our source document. As a ministry leader, you have to know how this brand new, viral first-century movement relates to the ancient Hebrew texts.
This is a point the source material insists upon with absolute clarity. The New Testament does not abolish the Old Testament. It fulfills it.
Okay, but wait, let me push back on that for a second.
Say that.
I know exactly how a skeptical reader or maybe a frustrated volunteer leading a discussion group feels about this.
Oh, absolutely.
Reading the Old Testament and then the New Testament back to back. It feels less like a seamless part two of a book series and more like a massive whiplash-inducing paradigm shift.
It really does feel that way sometimes.
Right. You spend hundreds of pages reading about strict Levitical dietary laws, animal sacrifices, and, frankly, holy wars. And then you turn the page to the New Testament, and suddenly Jesus is hanging out with tax collectors, saying all foods are clean, and telling people to love their enemies.
It's a jolt.
How in the world do scholars or theologians reconcile that shift and call it continuity? Like, how do you explain that to someone in your small group?
That perceived whiplash is exactly the tension the early first-century writers had to navigate and explain to their audiences. And they did it by introducing a very specific concept.
Okay.
The source describes the Old Testament as the period of preparation, while the New Testament is the period of manifestation.
Preparation and manifestation.
Right. The new doesn't replace the old like you'd throw away an outdated piece of software.
Mm-hmm.
It brings it to its intended ultimate completion.
The document hinges this entire explanation on a specific Greek word, right?
Yeah.
Diatheke.
Yes. Diathoke. It's the Greek word translated as covenant or testament.
Mm-hmm.
And we really have to understand what a covenant was in the ancient Near East.
Because it's not what we think of today.
Not at all. Today, when we hear covenant, we think of a contract. Like a user agreement you scroll to the bottom of and click accept without reading.
Right. And if someone breaks a contract, you just sue them. No big deal.
Exactly. But in the ancient world, it was much heavier than that, infinitely heavier.
Yeah.
A covenant was a binding, life or death, blood-sworn relational agreement. It was the deepest level of commitment possible between two parties. So the overarching narrative we're seeing here is the transition from the old covenant of law, which was mediated through Moses, to a new covenant of grace, mediated through Jesus Christ.
So how did the early writers actually prove this to an audience that knew the ancient texts backward and forward, like the Jewish audience?
Our source highlights two brilliant examples of how the writers argue this continuity. The first is the Gospel of Matthew.
Okay, let's look at Matthew.
Matthew is writing primarily to a deeply Jewish audience. He knows they are expecting a king. So his entire book is an aggressive, systematic apologetic. He relentlessly quotes ancient Old Testament prophecies and then points directly to Jesus' life, showing how Jesus fits those prophecies like a key perfectly turning a lock.
He's basically pointing back to the ancient blueprints and saying, look, the inclusion of the Gentiles, the concept of a suffering servant, the outpouring of the Spirit, none of this is a new invention.
Exactly.
It was literally drawn into the blueprints thousands of years ago.
Precisely. It was there the whole time. And the second example the source provides is the book of Hebrews. Hebrews presents a sustained, masterful philosophical and theological argument regarding the Levitical priesthood.
The Levitical priesthood being the ancient system where the high priest would go into the temple, specifically on the Day of Atonement, right?
Yes, Yom Kippur.
To offer animal blood to cover the things of the nation.
Exactly. The author of Hebrews argues that this entire ancient system of animal sacrifices, altars, and temple rituals was never designed by God to be the permanent solution.
It wasn't the end game.
Never. It was always meant to be a shadow, a physical, temporary metaphor pointing forward to an ultimate, permanent reality. Hebrews argues that Jesus is the ultimate high priest, and his death is the final, perfect sacrifice that completely renders the old shadow system obsolete.
Wow.
The shadow gives way to the substance.
That's powerful. So the continuity isn't about everything staying exactly the same. The continuity is that the old system was a chrysalis and the new system is the butterfly.
Oh, I love that.
You know, you don't need the chrysalis once the butterfly has emerged, but you definitely can't have the butterfly without the chrysalis.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
And understanding this transition brings us to a core framework highlighted in our source. Listen, for the lay leaders and volunteers listening right now, this is highly relevant.
Pay attention to this part.
Yes. It is a theological concept known as the already but not yet of the kingdom.
I want to spend some time here because this isn't just an abstract academic theory. This concept is deeply, deeply practical.
It really is.
It's the lens through which you actually make sense of the human experience. When you're shepherding the people in your care, this is the tool you need.
It is arguably the most protective framework anyone can have when trying to navigate personal suffering or pastoral care. The New Testament writers teach that the kingdom of God has already been inaugurated.
Right.
The ancient promises are fulfilled. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the decisive victory has been secured. The king has arrived on the battlefield.
But when you look out the window today, the world doesn't look completely victorious.
Exactly. That is the not yet. The final consummation, the ultimate eradication of all evil, sickness, and death has not yet happened.
Yeah.
We still live in a deeply fractured, broken world.
Yeah.
We still experience terminal illness, profound injustice, political corruption, and deep personal betrayal.
The analogy I always hear for this, which I think is so incredibly helpful, is comparing it to World War II. The tension between D-Day and V-Day.
Yes. The theologian Oscar Cullmann popularized that analogy, and it fits the New Testament worldview perfectly. When the Allied forces successfully landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, military historians will tell you the war was fundamentally decided.
The momentum had shifted permanently.
Exactly. The decisive battle was won. Hitler's defeat became a mathematical inevitability. That is the already.
But the war didn't end that day.
No, not at all. Between D-Day and VE Day victory in Europe Day, when the unconditional surrender was actually signed, there were months of incredibly brutal, bloody fighting.
Right, the Battle of the Bulge, all of that.
Exactly. The enemy was defeated, but they were still dangerous, lashing out violently as they retreated. That is the not yet.
And why this matters so much, why the source document emphasizes this for you as lay leaders, is because if you misunderstand this timeline, you end up doing massive psychological and spiritual damage to the people in your groups.
It's so true.
Like, if you only focus on the already, you accidentally create this toxic positivity.
Yeah.
You tell someone who just got a devastating cancer diagnosis, hey, Jesus won the victory, so you shouldn't be sad or struggling, just have enough faith and you'll be healed right now. Which is a crushing, unbiblical burden to place on someone who is hurting.
It's pastoral malpractice,
Yeah.
honestly. It leads to profound disillusionment when reality doesn't match the expectation. But on the flip side, if you only focus on the not yet, if you only stare at the suffering, the political chaos, and the waiting, you lose all hope.
You become cynical.
You become cynical and you burn out in your ministry because you forget that the ultimate outcome of the war is actually secure.
Understanding that tension, that we are living in the messy middle between D-Day and V-Day, gives you the grace to sit with people in their pain.
Yes.
Lets you acknowledge the horror of the not yet without ever losing the anchor of the already.
And that beautifully sets up the actual physical architecture of the library we've been handed.
Yeah, let's look at the books themselves.
These books were written specifically to guide people living in this already but not yet period. Our source makes a point to remind us that the New Testament is not one continuous book. We have to stop thinking of it as a single novel.
Right.
It is a library comprised of 27 distinct books, and it is divided into 5 specific literary wings.
And knowing which wing of the library you are standing in completely changes how you read the text. So let's walk through the architecture. The first wing contains the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Now, a modern reader approaches a gospel expecting a standard chronological biography. But the source points out these are not biographies in the modern sense.
They aren't trying to be a Wikipedia article.
Exactly. They are 4 unique portraits painted for 4 distinct audiences, highlighting different angles of the exact same historical subject.
Right. If you want a complete picture of a sculpture, you don't just look at it from the front. You
Right.
walk around it. You need multiple angles.
Exactly. We already mentioned Matthew writing to a Jewish audience, presenting Jesus as the ultimate king fulfilling prophecy. But Mark, on the other hand, was writing to a Roman audience.
Okay, and the Romans valued different things.
Very different things. The Romans valued action, power, and efficiency. So Mark's gospel is incredibly fast-paced. He constantly uses the word immediately.
Oh, I've noticed that.
Right. He skips the genealogy and the birth narrative entirely and jumps straight into Jesus' actions. He presents him as the tireless servant and the powerful conqueror of demons and disease.
Then you have Luke.
Luke was a highly educated Greek physician. He writes with the meticulous detail of a historian. He is writing to a Greek audience that valued the ideal, perfect man.
Like the Greek philosophers.
Exactly. So Luke emphasizes the humanity and deep compassion of Jesus. He presents him as the Son of Man who cares deeply for the marginalized, women, the poor, and the outcasts.
The source also gives us a really helpful categorization term here, the synoptic gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, what exactly does synoptic mean in this context?
The word comes from the Greek syn, meaning together, and optic, meaning seen. So seen together.
Seen together, okay.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a tremendous amount of the same chronological structure, parables, and narratives. You can literally line them up side by side in parallel columns and see how they match.
Which leaves John as the outlier.
John is the majestic outlier, written much later, likely toward the end of the 1st century. John is not concerned with a strict chronology of events.
Right.
He is writing a deeply theological, reflective portrait to a universal audience, soaring straight into the cosmic significance of Jesus. He presents him as the eternal Son of God, the divine Logos, or Word made flesh.
So that is the first wing, the 4 Gospels. The second wing of our library is history, which consists of just one single book, the Acts of the Apostles.
Acts is the crucial historical hinge of the entire New Testament. It is the direct sequel to Luke's Gospel.
Luke Part 2.
Exactly. If the Gospels are the spark, Acts is the explosion. It documents the continuation of Jesus' work through the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
It traces the explosive expansion of the early church from a tiny group of terrified disciples in a small upper room in Jerusalem, all the way to the sprawling multi-ethnic communities in the heart of the Roman Empire.
It literally tracks the viral spread along those Roman roads we talked about earlier.
It sure does, which leads us directly into the third wing of the library, the Pauline Epistles. 13 letters written by the Apostle Paul, stretching from Romans all the way to Philemon.
This is where the soaring theology of the Gospels gets applied to the dirty, unforgiving pavement of daily life.
Exactly.
Paul is writing to clarify massive, complex doctrines like justification by faith alone in Romans and Galatians, But he is also providing deeply practical, urgent ethical instructions for new communities, trying to figure out how to live out this strange new faith in a highly pluralistic pagan society.
And here is where the methodology of reading changes entirely. If I'm reading a history textbook, I read it one way. But the source notes, these are epistles. And an epistle is simply a letter.
Meaning, when we read the Pauline Epistles, we are essentially reading someone else's mail.
We absolutely are. And that context is vital.
Because these weren't written as abstract, detached academic essays that Paul leisurely drafted to be published in some theological journal.
No.
These were urgent, highly emotional, sometimes tear-stained letters sent to real people dealing with incredibly messy real-world community crises. I mean, let's look at Corinth.
Oh, Corinth is the perfect example.
If you read 1 Corinthians, it is a church dealing with massive internal division, shocking sexual immorality, lawsuits among members, and completely chaotic public gatherings.
Corinth is the perfect example of why you can't just read these letters in a vacuum. Corinth was a major, wealthy, bustling Roman port city. It was famous for its commerce and its rampant immorality. When Paul writes to them about, for example, whether or not a Christian can eat meat that has been sacrificed to a pagan idol, a modern reader might skim past that thinking, well, I don't buy meat sacrificed to Zeus at my local grocery store, so this doesn't apply to me at all.
But the mechanics of why Paul is addressing it are so fascinating, and it applies to so much of what we deal with today in ministry.
Exactly. In ancient Corinth, the pagan temples essentially functioned as the city's best steakhouses and social clubs.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The socioeconomic reality was that if you wanted to do business, network, or attend a civic function, it happened in a temple dining room where the meat was ritually dedicated to a pagan god.
So the Christians in Corinth are fiercely divided over this.
Yes. The wealthy Christians, who needed to attend these functions for their businesses, were arguing, hey, we know these pagan gods aren't real. Idols are just blocks of wood, so the meat is just meat. We have the theological freedom to eat it.
Which technically makes sense.
Right. But the poorer Christians, many of whom had just been rescued out of the terrifying, abusive cults of these exact pagan temples, were utterly traumatized by seeing their wealthy church leaders casually dining in the temples.
Oh, wow.
It was destroying their fragile consciences.
So Paul steps in, not just to give a dry theological ruling on meat, but to solve a real-world community crisis about class privilege, trauma, and love.
Exactly.
He essentially says, yes, your theology is technically correct, the idol is fake, but your theology is destroying your brother, and love must always trump your right to flex your theological freedom.
That is exactly how you read an epistle. You have to understand the messy crisis on the ground before you can extract the timeless principle. And honestly, it should be incredibly encouraging to any ministry leader today.
Yeah, why is that?
Because if you look at the modern church and think it is deeply flawed, disorganized, and full of drama, just read the New Testament.
Right.
The early church was not some pristine, flawless, glowing community of saints. They were deeply flawed humans struggling to live out the already but not yet. And Paul is frantically writing to them saying, remember who you are in Christ and act like it.
It takes the pressure off, doesn't it? You realize human nature hasn't changed. As a leader, you aren't doing it wrong just because your people are messy. Now, moving past Paul, the fourth wing is the general epistles. 8 letters, from Hebrews through Jude.
Unlike Paul's letters, which were usually addressed to a specific city with specific problems, like Corinth or Ephesus, these general epistles were mostly circulated to a wider, more universal audience across different regions.
So the tone is different.
The focus here shifts heavily. You see a massive emphasis on endurance through suffering and persecution, particularly in the letters of Peter, and severe warnings against false teachers trying to hijack the movement from within, as seen in Jude and 2 Peter.
And finally, the fifth wing, the grand finale of the library. Prophecy or apocalypse, the book of Revelation.
This wing requires the most careful interpretive lens of all. Our source categorizes it as apocalyptic literature. That is a very specific ancient literary genre.
Okay, break that down for us.
Apocalyptic literature, which you also see in parts of the Old Testament like Daniel or Ezekiel, uses incredibly vivid, highly symbolic, almost surreal imagery to convey deep spiritual truths.
So when we read about multi-headed beasts, dragons, and cosmic battles, we aren't meant to read it like a newspaper account of a literal zoological monster.
No. No, and doing so completely misses the point. Apocalyptic literature was often written to a minority group undergoing severe persecution.
Right.
In the case of Revelation, the early Christians were facing terrifying state-sponsored persecution under the Roman Emperor Domitian, who actually demanded to be worshipped as a god.
So the vivid symbolism was almost a form of coded language.
It functioned very much like a political cartoon or a coded message of resistance. The primary purpose of Revelation wasn't necessarily to provide a rigid chronological timeline of end-of-the-world events for 21st century readers to decode like a math equation.
Right.
Its primary purpose was to pull back the curtain on reality for terrified, suffering first-century Christians. It was written to show them that despite Rome's terrifying military and political power, God is ultimately on the throne, the enemy's time is short, and Jesus wins in the end.
Wow. It is a stunning piece of literature when you read it in that context. It changes everything.
It really does.
But now that we understand what the 27 books are and who they were written for, we have to circle back to the elephant in the room from the very beginning of our deep dive.
Ah, yes. The originals.
We are talking about letters dictated in the 1st century. Letters that were meant to be read aloud, passed around, and copied. How did these specific documents survive the fires, the wars, the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the passage of 2 millennia to end up bound together as a single authoritative canon?
It's a huge question.
This brings us to the mechanics of preservation.
And the physical history of how this happened is just fascinating. Our source notes that in the ancient world, authors rarely sat down with a quill and physically wrote the text themselves.
Really?
Yeah. Writing materials like papyrus, which was made from woven reeds from the Nile, were extremely expensive. And writing was a specialized physical labor. So authors dictated their work to a highly trained professional scribe, known as an amanuensis.
So when we picture the Apostle Paul writing the book of Romans, we shouldn't picture him like hunched over a desk in a quiet study with a candle.
No, not at all.
He's likely pacing the floor, speaking out loud, formulating these massive theological arguments, while a scribe is carefully writing it all down.
Exactly. In fact, in the book of Romans, the scribe actually inserts his own little greeting at the very end.
Oh, wait, really?
Yes. Romans 16:22 says, I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, greet you in the Lord.
I love that.
And some scholars believe Paul had poor eyesight, which is why at the end of the letter to the Galatians, Paul actually takes the pen from the scribe and writes, see with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand.
I love those little gritty human details. It makes it so real. But once Tertius finishes writing Romans on that scroll of papyrus, how does it go from being a local letter to being considered the sacred, authoritative Word of God? How did the early church decide which books made the final cut? Because the popular rumor, which you see in movies like The Da Vinci Code, is that hundreds of years later, the Emperor Constantine held a big political council at Nicaea, and a bunch of powerful men just voted on which books gave them the most political power, and they burned the rest.
Yeah, that is a wildly popular, highly dramatized, and historically bankrupt modern myth.
Okay, so it didn't happen like that.
Not even close. The Council of Nicaea had absolutely nothing to do with deciding the canon of the New Testament. The process of canonization was much more organic, rigorous, and decentralized.
And the word canon literally means a measuring rod, right?
Yes, a standard. The primary standard for a book to be recognized as authoritative scripture by the early church communities was apostolic authority.
Meaning what, exactly?
Was the document written by an apostle, someone who's a direct eyewitness to the resurrected Christ, or was it written by a close, verifiable associate of an apostle?
Got it. So, for example, Mark wasn't an apostle, but he was a close associate of Peter, writing down Peter's eyewitness accounts.
Exactly.
And Luke wasn't an apostle, but he traveled extensively with Paul, and he tells us he interviewed eyewitnesses.
That's right. The secondary criteria were, was the book universally accepted and read in the church communities across the whole empire, not just in one weird splinter group? And did its theology align with the orthodox teachings of the apostles?
And the source mentions a fascinating historical reality here that actually pushes against the whole rubber stamp conspiracy theory. It mentions a category of books called the Antilegomena.
Ah, yes. The Antilegomena translates to the disputed books.
Yeah.
This is crucial for understanding the rigor of the early church. Not every single book in our modern New Testament was instantly universally accepted by every church from day one.
Okay.
Some books were heavily scrutinized and debated for decades, even centuries, before eventually being universally recognized.
Why were they disputed? Like, what were the red flags?
Well, the Book of Hebrews, for instance, was disputed simply because it is entirely anonymous. It doesn't name its author, so establishing that required apostolic authority was difficult.
Makes sense.
The Book of James was disputed by some early readers because, on a surface reading, it seemed to contradict Paul's teaching on faith versus works. And the Book of Revelation was disputed heavily in the Eastern churches because its bizarre apocalyptic imagery was already being twisted and misused by fringe cults.
Which, honestly, when you think about it, should give us more confidence, not less.
Absolutely.
If a powerful emperor really did just invent the Bible at a political council, it would be perfectly clean. There wouldn't be any record of dispute. The fact that the Anti-Legomena exists proves the early Christians were incredibly careful. They debated, they cross-referenced, they tested the authority of these texts relentlessly.
They were deeply, deeply reverent about what they considered divine authority. They didn't just accept any document that had the word Jesus stamped on it.
Right.
But this brings us right back to our opening dilemma. Even with this rigorous process of canonization, the original physical documents, the autographs, the actual papyrus that Tertius wrote Romans on, are entirely lost to history. They decomposed, they were burned in persecutions, they crumbled.
So I have to ask the skeptic's question again. If we only have copies of copies, and humans are notoriously bad at copying things without making mistakes, how can you possibly claim that the text we read today is a reliable reconstruction of what they actually wrote? How do we know the message wasn't fundamentally altered?
It is the most important question to ask. And the answer lies in the deeply fascinating scientific field of textual criticism, which our source explicitly highlights as the foundation of our modern translations.
Okay.
Here is why scholars have immense confidence. While we do not have the original autographs, we have an overwhelming, unprecedented avalanche of ancient handwritten manuscripts.
How many are we talking about?
We currently have over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, plus tens of thousands of early translations in Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. To put that in perspective, if you look at classical historical works that we unquestioningly accept as accurate, like Homer's Iliad or the writings of Plato or Julius Caesar's accounts of the Gallic Wars, historians consider them perfectly reliable based on maybe a dozen or at most a few hundred manuscript copies.
A dozen.
Yeah, and those copies often date to 500 or 600 years after the author actually lived.
So the New Testament manuscript evidence is a mountain compared to a molehill.
It's not even close. Because early Christians viewed these writings as the words of life, they copied them meticulously and spread them rapidly across the entire known world. So what textual scholars do is compare all these thousands of manuscripts from different regions, Egypt, Rome, Syria, and from different centuries.
But when you compare 5,800 handwritten manuscripts, you are going to find mistakes.
Oh, absolutely. Scribes were human. They made errors. Textual critics call these variants. But here is the key. When people hear that there are hundreds of thousands of variants in the New Testament manuscripts, they assume that means hundreds of thousands of theological contradictions.
Right. They picture whole chapters being rewritten to change the story.
Exactly. But the vast, overwhelming majority of these variants are just the ancient equivalent of typos. A scribe misspells a name. A scribe accidentally inverts the word order writing Jesus Christ instead of Christ Jesus.
Oh, I see.
Or a very common error called haplography, where a scribe is copying a text, his eye skips down a line because two sentences end with the exact same word, and he accidentally omits a sentence.
So how do scholars fix it if they don't have the original to check it against?
By cross-referencing families of manuscripts. If a scribe in Rome makes a visual copying error in the year 200, that error will be copied by anyone who uses his manuscript in the West. But the manuscripts being copied down in Egypt or over in Syria won't have that specific error.
Because they're copying from a different master copy?
Yes, because the text spread so fast, in so many different directions, no single centralized authority could ever corrupt the whole stream.
It's like a decentralized blockchain. If one node tries to alter the ledger, the thousands of other independent nodes immediately flag it as an anomaly and correct it.
That is a brilliant modern analogy. The sheer volume of manuscripts allows scholars to trace the family trees of these documents back to the source. They triangulate the highly accurate original wording. And our source mentions the result of this painstaking work. The NA28.
The Nestle-Aland 28th edition.
Yes. This is the gold standard. It's the master Greek text that modern scholars from all over the world have collaboratively reconstructed from all that massive manuscript evidence. It is what our modern, reliable translations are based on.
That's amazing.
So when you open your Bible, you aren't reading the result of a 2,000-year game of telephone where the message gets garbled. You are reading a meticulously verified, critically reconstructed text that accurately reflects the original authors with astonishing precision.
That is deeply reassuring, especially for leaders who are teaching this stuff every week. It means you are standing on solid historical ground.
You really are.
Which brings us to the final, most practical destination in our source document, the rules of engagement. Having established what the text is, the history it grew out of, and how it was miraculously preserved, how do we actually read it without completely butchering it?
Well, our source provides a fantastic framework for hermeneutics.
Hermeneutics being the actual science and defined rules of how we interpret ancient texts. Because again, if you just open a book blindly, point your finger, and read a verse completely out of its historical setting, you can make the Bible say almost anything you want.
You really can. You can justify terrible things if you ignore hermeneutics. So the source lays out specific foundational rules. The very first rule listed, context is king.
Context is king. Give me a concrete example of what happens when we ignore this.
The classic example is Philippians 4.33. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Yeah, the coffee mug verse.
Exactly. If you ignore context, you see this verse on a coffee mug or painted on eye black on a football player, and you interpret it as a magic formula for personal success. I can hit this home run. I can pass this math test. I can get this promotion through Christ.
But the text instructs us to read the immediate paragraph, the chapter, and the historical background.
Exactly. When you look at the context, Paul is writing this letter from a Roman prison cell.
Right.
He is chained up, awaiting trial, facing possible execution. The verses immediately preceding this say, I know what it is to have plenty, and I know what it is to face starvation and need. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation.
Wow.
So Philippians 4.13 isn't a promise of triumphant athletic or financial success.
Yeah.
It's a profound declaration that Christ gives him the strength to endure starvation, imprisonment, and suffering without losing his faith.
Which is a much deeper, more beautiful truth. But you completely miss it if you rip it out of context. The second rule the source highlights is authorial intent.
This is a vital check on our modern egos. Before we are ever allowed to ask, what does this verse mean to me today? We're required to ask, what did the inspired author actually mean to communicate to his original first-century audience?
Right. It forces us to listen first.
We have to respect the historical anchor. You aren't allowed to invent your own highly creative, personalized meaning if it violates what the author actually intended to say to the Corinthians or the Ephesians.
And the third principle, Christ-centered. Our source points back to the Gospel of Luke, specifically chapter 24, where Jesus is walking on the road to Emmaus after the resurrection.
Such a powerful story.
He is walking with two disciples, and he goes through the entire Old Testament explaining how all the scriptures ultimately point to him.
And that's the model. If you are analyzing a passage or teaching a Sunday school lesson, and you don't somehow connect it back to the grand, overarching narrative of redemption through Jesus, you haven't finished the job. Every minor theme is a tributary that eventually flows into the main river of the gospel.
And finally, we have the literal, grammatical, historical principle.
It sounds like an academic mouthful, but it is incredibly practical. It simply means taking the text at face value while ruthlessly recognizing its literary genre.
Which goes back to the library concept.
Exactly. We talked earlier about the library having different wings. You don't read a poetic psalm with the same wooden literalism you use to read a historical narrative in Acts.
Right.
And you certainly don't read a practical, logical argument in the letter to the Romans the same way you read the apocalyptic, surreal symbolism of Revelation.
If I read a news report about a bull market on Wall Street, I don't literally think there are farm animals running through downtown Manhattan.
Right.
I understand the idiom and the genre of financial reporting.
Precisely. You have to read the text according to the rules of its specific genre.
So, synthesizing all of this, moving from what did it mean then to what does it mean now, it forces us to realize that avoiding the trap of taking a verse out of context isn't just about winning theological arguments.
No, not at all.
It's fundamentally an act of respect. You are respecting the original historical setting, the original author, and the original audience before you extract the timeless application for your own life or for the people you are leading.
Because true study of these texts, as the source concludes, shouldn't just puff up our academic knowledge. We didn't do this deep dive just to win a first-century history trivia night.
Yeah.
Engaging with this library is meant to actually transform conduct and faith.
Yeah.
It is meant to shape how you view the world, how you endure suffering, and how you understand the grand narrative of human history.
We have covered massive sweeping ground today.
We really have.
We looked at the exact historical mechanisms of the Pax Romana and Koine Greek that allowed a message to go viral. We unpacked the profound transition from the ancient covenant of law to the new covenant of grace.
And how to navigate that tension of the already but not yet in a broken world.
Yes, so crucial. We walked through the diverse five-wing architecture of a 27-book library. We broke down the staggering process of canonization and textual criticism that proves the reliability of our modern translations, and we landed on the disciplined rules of hermeneutics that keep us grounded in truth.
It is a breathtaking landscape when you step back and really see the entire forest. And as we close, I want to leave everyone with one final profound thought to mull over. Consider the sheer, staggering improbability of this library's survival.
Yeah, let's think about that.
Think about the physical reality. These books were written by multiple authors across decades. Many of them were poor, marginalized fishermen or tent makers.
Yeah.
They were living in the shadow of a dominating, hostile pagan empire that eventually tried to actively exterminate them. These words were paced out and dictated in damp prison cells. They were written on fragile reeds from the Nile. They were copied by hand, by candlelight, thousands upon thousands of times over centuries. They survived the absolute destruction of their cultural epicenter in Jerusalem in AD 70. They survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, and millennia of wars.
It's unbelievable.
By all logical historical metrics, these texts should have decomposed in the desert and disappeared into the sands of time as a minor, forgotten footnote of ancient history.
But they didn't.
No. Instead, this incredibly diverse library somehow survived to become the most studied, debated, heavily scrutinized, and deeply beloved text in the history of human civilization. How does knowing the gritty historical reality of its assembly, the sweat, the ink, the terrifying political pressure, the sheer mathematical improbability of its preservation, change the way you view the physical book sitting on your desk or the app on your phone today?
What an incredibly provocative thought. It really does change everything. You aren't just opening a static manual. You are stepping into a historical miracle of preservation.
Absolutely.
And to all the lay leaders and volunteers listening right now, your service matters deeply to the kingdom. Remember that the same Christ who preserved this text equips all those he calls. You don't have to be a perfect human GPS. You just have to faithfully point them back to the text. Thank you for joining us on this massive journey. Keep questioning the narratives, keep seeking the historical context, and keep exploring the sources that continue to shape our world. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.